possible that price could come up and play around back at this 1420 level that Jitendra pointed out cannot be broken. It could come up very close to that level. It could even break that level by a few points. Okay. According to Hurst cyclic principles, this peak here in the last week of, or the last 2 weeks of March of this year, would remain what would be called the orthodox top, because it is the orthodox peak. It is the peak that the cyclic tools point to as the peak. If price comes up to those levels and breaches those levels by a point or two in a very subtle way, and the cyclic tools are still saying that this is the peak over here, then that would remain the official peak. So a peak in Hurst cyclic terms is not as absolute as a peak or a trough in Elliott wave terms. But we don't expect price to go much higher than that level, basically. Okay, it's not an absolute, but it's it's a very good indication that we have seen the highest peak. Let's go back to our Australian markets and look at what has happened differently here. Well, the first thing, of course, is that, as I mentioned previously, the first sub-wave of the 40-week cycle has a bearish shape to it, whereas the US markets, that first sub-wave has a bullish shape to it. Let's take a look at the VTL. There we go. Let's take a look at the VTLs on the Australian market. Now, how will we know when a peak of the 40-week cycle has been formed? Well, one way that we will know is when price crosses down below the 20-week VTL, which I showed you happened in the first week of April in the US markets. Very interestingly, as you can see here, the Australian market has not crossed down below the same 20-week VTL, and therefore the Australian markets are telling us that the peak of the 40-week cycle has not yet been confirmed, or it hasn't occurred yet. Okay, so that peak of the 40-week cycle might be about to happen in the Australian markets, probably fairly soon. Okay, or if prices turn down tomorrow in the Australian markets, then of course this peak way back in October might prove to be the highest level that the market saw in the current 40-week cycle. So we're at a very interesting point in the Australian markets. Let's take a look at the FLDs, which would give us that same evidence. Let's take a look at the 40-week FLD first of all, and see whether there is any evidence that the 40-week cycle has experienced a peak. Now, as you can see here, for a period of, and let me zoom in over here. This is the 40-week FLD. As you can see over here, price dropped down below the 40-week FLD for a brief period. That's about, it's not even 2 weeks, and then it popped back up again above the 40-week FLD. Hurst cyclic principles are not absolute. Markets aren't perfect. I don't take that FLD cross very seriously. Okay, and so for me that is not an indication that we have seen the peak of the 40-week cycle, because price is back up above the 40-week FLD. And let's have a look at what's been happening more recently, and let me change this graph to a median graph, a line on median graph. Where is price now? Price is quite high above the 40-week cycle, so it's nowhere near close to confirming that 40-week cycle peak has occurred. Let's take a look at the shorter cycles. The 20-week cycle, price has been remaining stubbornly above the 20-week FLD, and so there is absolutely no evidence that the 40-week cycle has been formed yet. Let's let's take a look at the shorter term picture and see what's unfolding. Now, we know that the Australian market is probably going to be forming a peak, which is going to prove to be a peak of the 40-week cycle fairly soon. Now, why is that likely to happen? Markets in different places in the world tend to move in unison, but they have some subtleties and some differences between them, which is what today's Trader Chat's been about. If you're a trader in Australia, and I know many of you are, you need to keep an eye on the American markets, of course. The American markets have formed a peak of the current 40-week cycle. And I believe that's a danger sign for Australia. Why? Because when the Americans form a peak, when the American markets form a peak of any particular cycle, the Australian markets are likely to be forming peaks round about the same time. Okay, the cycles manifest differently in Australia to the way in which they manifest in America. But when the American markets have formed a clear peak and have started heading downwards towards that 40-week cycle trough, as an Australian, I believe you need to stay on your toes. And I think you need to say, okay, the Americans are heading down towards their 40-week cycle trough. We are likely to turn down fairly soon and start heading down to that 40-week cycle trough ourselves. Okay, so I would recommend staying on your toes. I think that the Australian markets are probably going to start turning down fairly soon. Let's zoom out again and show those VTLs again, because the VTLs are painting quite an interesting picture. When you see this is a textbook VTL picture, if you like, where each shorter VTL is giving us a tighter and a tighter line on the markets. Okay, I believe that this is a very dangerous VTL picture that is developing, because the cycles are all lining up very closely to confirm their peaks and start moving and start moving downwards. Of course, we know that we can't expect synchronized peaks, but I believe that the 40-week cycle is very likely to be attached to a fairly short cycle peak. And next week's Trader Chat, I'd like to speak a little bit more about it. We don't have time to speak more about it now, but I believe that you need to be wary of the peaks that are going to start forming in the Australian market. Now, let's take a look at some of those levels. Here you can see the 10-day VTL, which means that the current 20-day cycle will have formed a peak when price crosses down below that level. Now, that 10-day VTL is currently sitting at 43.54.5. Okay, 43.54.5. So it's not very far below the current level of the market. And that's for tomorrow. That's Friday's trading. What about Monday's trading? Monday's trading, that 10-day VTL has climbed up to the level of today's close, 43.75. Okay, the Australian market is going to be under quite a lot of pressure over the weekend, which sounds like a funny thing to say because you're not trading. Okay, I would suggest you be fairly cautious, because if on Monday the Australian markets have crossed below this 10-day VTL, then that would be evidence that the current 20-day cycle has experienced a peak. So if price finds itself below this 10-day VTL next week, then you have evidence that the 20-day cycle has formed a peak. Okay, which means then that the market's going to be moving down to form the 20-day cycle. As soon as price crosses down below the 40-day VTL, which I've plotted there, there isn't a useful 20-day VTL at the moment, then we have evidence that the 80-day cycle has formed a peak. And those peaks are going to begin sort of falling like dominoes, I suspect, upon each other. So I I would recommend, with this very bearish looking VTL picture, I would recommend that you be cautious in the Australian market. I know that possibly in Australia at the moment there is a tremendous amount of bullishness and enthusiasm because the Australian markets have been holding up remarkably well relative to the American markets. Yes, that's true, but eventually the Australian market is going to begin to fall in line in terms of the cyclic picture that's unfolding with the American market, and so I would recommend some caution. Perhaps I'm a bearish voice in a sea of bullish feeling, but I would certainly be cautious in terms of what might be about to unfold in the Australian markets, with the 40-week cycle due for a turn down and a move down into a trough towards the middle of this year. That's really all I wanted to speak about in today's Trader Chat, a discussion of the Australian markets, and in particular comparing them with what's happening in the US markets, in the American markets. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your interest in Sentient Trader. And if you have any questions about Sentient Trader or about Hurst cyclic principles, anything you'd like to ask, then send us an email, and I will answer those questions in next week's Oz Trader Chat, and of course also answer those questions by email. Thank you for being with us again, and I would recommend that you are a little careful with what's happening in the Australian markets at the moment. And I look forward to seeing you all